It was a quiet August morning in Frederick, Colorado. The kind of morning that promised another ordinary day in the suburbs. The lawns along Saratoga Trail were neatly trimmed, the driveways lined with family SUVs, and the sun rose over the Rockies with a calm that felt almost cinematic. But inside one of those identical houses, silence had begun to stretch too long. When a friend couldn't reach 34-year-old Shannon Watts, a mother of two, 15 weeks pregnant, and known for her bubbly optimism, she did what most friends would never imagine doing. She called the police. Within hours, officers stood at the doorstep of the Watts family home. The doorbell camera captured a man opening the door. Calm, polite, even friendly. It was her husband, Chris Watts. The man who, only hours earlier, had texted Shannon "love you" before she disappeared without a trace. The officer-esque body cam footage from that first welfare check would later become one of the most analyzed clips in true crime history. It showed Chris standing awkwardly, folding his arms, chatting with neighbors, glancing nervously toward his truck. There was no visible panic, no raw emotion, just a strangely measured politeness, as if he were helping with someone else's missing person case. At that moment, America didn't yet know it was staring into the face of a killer. Two neighbors and friends, Chris and Shannon Watts, were the definition of an all-American family. They had the suburban house, the two daughters, Bella 4 and Celeste 3, and a social media feed that radiated domestic happiness. Shannon, a driven and charismatic woman, often posted videos celebrating her husband and children. She shared their milestones, their trips, and even the small, funny moments of parenthood that make strangers on the internet smile. Her followers saw a loving husband, a quiet, steady man who adored his wife and girls. In video after video, Chris appeared as the ideal partner. Patient, supportive, a little shy, but devoted. They were the couple everyone envied, hardworking, cheerful, building a future in the American heartland. But behind those polished smiles, life was not as effortless as it looked. By the summer of 2018, the Watts marriage was strained. They were drowning in debt, mortgage, car payments, medical bills. Shannon's frequent business trips left Chris home alone for long stretches, and distance began to grow in ways she didn't fully see. When she excitedly announced her third pregnancy to him, recording it on her phone for social media, Chris's reaction was subdued, distant even. Behind the scenes, he had begun an affair with a co-worker, Nicole Kessinger, a relationship that gave him a dangerous illusion of escape. Friends later described how he had started losing weight, working out obsessively, and talking about a new chapter. To Shannon, it must have felt like her husband was drifting. To Chris, it may have felt like he was becoming someone new, someone unburdened by responsibility. That duality, the devoted family man and the restless dreamer, would soon collide in one of the most haunting crimes in modern American history. On August 13th, 2018, Shannon returned home from a business trip to Arizona. Arriving around 2 a.m., security footage shows her entering the house for what would be the last time. By the next morning, she and her daughters were gone. When police arrived later that day, they found her purse, phone, and medication still inside the house. The children's blankets and favorite toys were untouched. Everything seemed frozen in time, as if the family had simply vanished mid-routine. Chris stood outside, pacing. He told officers that Shannon might have left with the kids to visit a friend. His voice was even, his tone cooperative. He let them search the house, the garage, even his truck. But as the camera followed him, viewers later noticed small details that investigators would soon seize upon: a flicker of anxiety, a quick glance toward his neighbor's camera, a tension in his shoulders that never fully eased. Within 48 hours, the perfect husband image began to crumble. Detectives grew suspicious when they reviewed the neighbor's surveillance video. It showed Chris backing his truck into the garage early that morning, unusual for him, and loading something large under the cover of darkness. His story about Shannon taking the kids began to unravel. The comfort that had made him seem rational now made him look cold. Meanwhile, Chris continued giving TV interviews, pleading for his family's return. The contrast was unnerving. While most husbands in his position would be breaking down, he appeared almost rehearsed, his words smooth but hollow. The nation was watching, but no one yet knew the truth. By the time those interviews aired, Shannon, Bella, and Celeste were already gone, and the man standing under the spotlight pleading for their safe return, had already buried his secret deep beneath the Colorado soil. By the morning of August 14, 2018, the small town of Frederick, Colorado, had transformed into the center of a mystery that felt both ordinary and impossible. News vans crowded the quiet street. Volunteers organized search efforts. Social media buzzed with theories, prayers, and hope. And at the center of it all stood Chris Watts, the husband, the father, the man whose calm composure had begun to unsettle even those closest to him. The first 48 hours in any disappearance are critical. For investigators, inconsistencies are like cracks in glass. Small at first, but once pressure builds, they spread fast. Chris's story had those cracks. Detectives from the Frederick Police Department and agents from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation CBI quickly noticed something off. Shanann's car was still in the garage, her wallet and keys inside the house. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of a planned trip. For a mother of two, leaving without essentials made no sense. Chris repeated his account. He had left for work early that morning, and when he returned, Shanann and the girls were gone. His tone never wavered, calm, polite, and oddly detached. Two trained investigators. Such composure can be telling. Most spouses in crisis display visible distress, confusion, anger, desperation. Chris's emotional neutrality read as performance. Then came the footage from his neighbor's security camera. While reviewing footage, a neighbor mentioned that Chris had backed his work truck into the driveway, something he never did before. The camera caught him walking back and forth between the truck and the garage multiple times before dawn. When officers asked what he was doing, Chris explained that he was loading tools for work. The neighbor glanced at the police officer and quietly muttered, "He's not acting right." In that moment, suspicion turned into direction. Investigators began focusing less on the idea of a missing person and more on the possibility of over the next day. Chris was brought in for questioning. Inside the sterile walls of the CBI interview room, the mask began to slip. Investigators, led by Agent Tammy Lee and Detective Graham Coder, approached him with patience and precision, alternating between empathy and challenge. The goal was not confrontation, but connection. They let him talk about his marriage, his stress, his love for his daughters. Chris painted himself as a devoted father, trapped in a failing relationship. But as hours passed, his inconsistencies grew. His phone records didn't align with his timeline. GPS data from his truck showed unusual movement. And then, investigators revealed what they already knew. His affair with a coworker had come to light. That revelation shifted everything. The model husband image crumbled in real time. Chris's eyes darted, his breathing quickened, and the calm that once seemed reassuring now felt like pure artifice. On August 15th, Chris agreed to take a polygraph test. An extraordinary decision for someone under suspicion. Agent Lee later told him, "There's no way you can pass this test if you're lying." He didn't. When confronted with the failed results, Chris sat in silence. The room seemed to close in. Finally, in a strained voice, he said, "I want to talk to my dad." That single request marked the beginning of the end. When his father entered the room, Chris began to unravel. Through halting words and shifting blame, he claimed that after a moment of rage, something terrible had happened. But his story twisted, deflected, and never quite matched the evidence. Investigators pressed gently but firmly. They knew the truth was darker than he could say aloud. And within hours, after nearly 3 days of deception, Chris Watts finally admitted what the evidence had been pointing to all along, that his family would never be coming home. The confession, captured on video, would later become one of the most infamous interrogations in true crime story, not for its drama, but for its eerie absence of emotion. He spoke not like a man in grief, but like someone describing a logistical problem he had already solved. Guided by his statements, investigators turned their search toward the remote oil field where Chris worked, a desolate stretch of land owned by Anadarko Petroleum. There, authorities discovered what they had feared most. The search ended, but the questions had only begun. Within days, the FBI joined state investigators to reconstruct the timeline. They used cell tower pings, vehicle GPS data, and digital forensics from text messages, emails, and social media posts to build a minute-by-minute picture of Chris's actions. Technology revealed what his words had tried to hide. Every step, every movement, every text, all pointed to careful planning rather than impulse. The moment of rage narrative fell apart completely. In the quiet precision of forensic analysis, the truth became undeniable. This was a premeditated act. When news of the confession broke, the reaction across the US was visceral. How could a man who seemed so normal, even kind, destroy everything he built? Social media, which had once amplified the image of a perfect marriage, now turned into a public courtroom. Every old video, every Facebook post, became a piece of tragic irony. The smiling family Christmas clips that once brought warmth now carried a chilling undertone. It was as if the entire nation realized that evil doesn't always look like a villain. Sometimes, it looks like your neighbor mowing the lawn. Experts began weighing in. Was Chris Watts a narcissist? A sociopath? A man under extreme stress who snapped? Criminal psychologists pointed to the phenomenon of the family annihilator. Typically a man who appears stable and successful but hides internal collapse. When the image of control fractures, financial stress, emotional failure, loss of status, he sees destruction as a twisted form of escape. But what made the Watts case extraordinary was not just the crime itself, but how ordinary everything appeared until the very end. By the end of that week, Chris Watts was in custody. The illusion of suburban perfection had evaporated, leaving a community reeling and a nation transfixed. In an age where lives are curated for public view, the case forced an unsettling reflection. How much of what we see online is real, and how much is performance? For investigators, the work was done. But for the rest of America, the story had only just begun. A mirror held up to a culture, obsessed with appearances, and a haunting reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones smiling in family photos. When Chris Watts appeared in court for the first time in August 2018, the world watched in near disbelief. Shackled, silent, and expressionless, he looked less like a monster than a man hollowed out. The same composure that had once made him seem reasonable now appeared chillingly vacant. Prosecutors from Weld County built their case on a mountain of digital evidence, text messages, GPS, data, and search records rather than on spectacle. They presented a portrait of a man who had constructed a double life, juggling a family and a secret relationship until the tension became untenable. Defense attorneys faced an impossible task, with the confession, the forensic trail, and the national outrage. A trial promised to re-traumatize the victims' families and amplify the media circus. After negotiations, Chris Watts entered a guilty plea in November 2018 to avoid the death penalty. In a quiet courtroom that November morning, he was sentenced to 5 life terms without the possibility of parole, plus additional years for obstruction. The judge's closing words echoed through the silence. The sheer horror of it all, and the calculated nature of your actions, demands the most severe penalty available. There was no outburst, no final statement, just the sound of the gavel and a life ending behind bars. Once the verdict was delivered, psychologists and criminologists began to dissect the case. How does an apparently devoted father destroy his own family? Experts pointed again to the family annihilator profile men who measure self-worth through control and status. When that illusion cracks, they may erase the evidence of failure rather than face exposure. Watts fit the pattern, almost textbook perfectly. Financial strain, emotional distance, and a desire for But there was another, more modern dimension. The curated world of social media performance. Shannon's Facebook page had chronicled their domestic happiness in luminous detail gifts, vacations, playful moments. To millions, they seemed aspirational. To Chris, investigators believed, the endless public portrait of perfection became unbearable. It was a life he no longer recognized as his own. Dr. Kathleen Naide, a criminologist at the University of South Florida, later described such cases as crimes of annihilation and control, where the perpetrator seeks not only to escape but to dictate the final narrative. The public version of the Watts family, the smiling suburban dream, had to vanish so that his private reinvention could exist, however briefly. This case also marked a milestone in modern investigation. Digital footprints told the real story. Every text, Google search, and GPS coordinate became a witness. Analysts reconstructed an exact timeline that revealed intention long before confession. In the post-trial debrief, law enforcement officials emphasized how data forensics now functions as psychology's partner. While the human mind can lie, devices rarely do. The Watts investigation demonstrated that technology could expose motive through behavior, not speculation, a model later used in domestic violence. Homicide training nationwide. The sentencing did not end public fascination. It transformed it. Wheaton-Mont's documentaries, podcasts, and YouTube analyses dissected every frame of police footage. The Netflix film American Murder. The Family Next Door 2020 used body cam and social media clips exclusively, creating an unnervingly intimate narrative told entirely through real data, no actors, no narration. Viewers were confronted with an uncomfortable question. Had society's appetite for constant online sharing made this tragedy feel too close? Shannon's posts, once symbols of joy, were replayed endlessly as evidence, commentary, or even speculation. Critics accused the media of commodifying grief, turning a family's destruction into entertainment. Yet many advocates argued the opposite, that such visibility turned the case into a powerful lesson about domestic violence, awareness, hidden abuse, and the dangers of idealized social facade. The Watts case reshaped how Americans viewed the perfect family. It revealed how his audiences can mistake visibility for authenticity. The smiling photos, the cheerful updates. The image of success all served as a shield for dysfunction and despair. Sociologists now cite the case in studies on digital identity, exploring how online self-branding pressures couples to maintain illusions of harmony. The story became a modern morality tale. When the pursuit of perfection meets unresolved conflict, appearance can become its own trap. Beyond academia, it changed public conversation about warning signs. Community organizations and women's safety groups used the case to educate families about emotional withdrawal, secrecy, and financial isolation. The subtle red flags that often precede domestic tragedy. Today, Chris Watts remains in a high-security facility far from Colorado. He rarely speaks publicly, and the letters he receives from strangers oscillate between condemnation and morbid curiosity. In interviews, investigators have said that his demeanor behind bars remains eerily unchanged, quiet, polite, detached. For law enforcement, the case became a blueprint on how modern domestic crimes are investigated. For society, it remains an open wound, a reminder that beneath the architecture of ordinary life, darkness can exist unseen. The Watts murders didn't merely shock America. They unsettled itself. The tragedy blurred the line between private and public, between authenticity and performance. True crime audiences continue to debate motive and psychology, but perhaps the deeper story is cultural. The same platforms that celebrated love and family also preserved the evidence of their disintegration. The camera never lied. It simply recorded the moments before reality collapsed. In that sense, the case of Chris Watts is more than a crime. It's a parable of the digital age. That no filter, no smile, and no suburban facade can conceal the truth forever. Long after the courtroom emptied and the cameras left Frederick, Colorado, the story of the Watts family lingered like an echo through American life. The street where they had lived remained painfully ordinary. Children rode bikes past trimmed hedges. Neighbors waved, and new families moved in. Yet the house on Saratoga Trail stood as a quiet monument to a truth many preferred not to face. Sometimes the darkness we fear most lies behind familiar doors. In the months following the sentencing, Frederick tried to reclaim its sense of normalcy. Candlelight vigils filled the small park downtown, where residents gathered not to relive the horror but to reaffirm community. They spoke Shannon's name and those of Bella and Celeste in the soft glow of candles. What outsiders saw as a crime scene, locals insisted on remembering as a place of love, however fragile that love had become. Shannon's family, the Erzucheks, became quiet advocates for domestic violence. Awareness, they refused to let their daughter and granddaughters be reduced to headlines or case studies. They were real, their father told reporters. They were light. That's what we want people to remember. Law enforcement. Agencies across the country studied the investigation as a model for the digital era. The precision with which detectives assembled the timeline, cell tower data, GPS logs, Text messages became part of police training curricula on domestic violence homicide. The case proved that the smallest digital trace can preserve a voice that perpetrators hope to silence. For social scientists, the Watts tragedy opened an uncomfortable conversation about the pressure of perfection in modern life. The couple's carefully curated online presence had once been a symbol of success. Afterward, it became a mirror reflecting how Azali performance can obscure reality. Sociologists argued that the constant pursuit of the picture-perfect life can trap people in roles they no longer inhabit, turning authenticity into another performance. When American Murder, The Family Next Door premiered on Netflix in 2020, it reignited national debate. The documentary used only real footage, body cams, texts, Facebook videos to tell the story without a narrator. Viewers experienced the unraveling of a life entirely through screens, just as the world had first learned of it. Some critics questioned whether such raw access blurred the line between awareness and exploitation. Others argued that seeing the truth through unfiltered evidence forced society to confront how violence hides in plain sight. Either way, the film marked a cultural shift. Audiences no longer consume true crime as distant spectacle, but as a reflection of their own digital lives. Chris Watts now lives in near isolation at a maximum security facility, far from Colorado. He spends his days working small maintenance jobs, reading religious texts, and rarely speaking to other inmates. Reporters who have requested interviews describe a man who still appears bewildered by his own choice as a human void, rather than a villain. Psychologists who analyze his case often stress that understanding motive is not the same as excusing it. The lesson, they say, lies in recognizing patterns of control, denial, and secrecy before they materialize. Every year, training seminars use the Watts investigation to teach early intervention strategies in at-risk relationships. The story as endurance is not just about one man's crime, but about the culture that surrounded it. In the age of social media, everyone curates a version of themselves: smiling vacations, new houses, filtered joy. The Watts family became a tragic symbol of how those curated images can hide profound disconnection. Yet out of tragedy came dialogue. Online communities once obsessed with true crime, speculation began fundraising for shelters and mental health programs. Victim advocacy organizations reported a surge in calls from people recognizing warning signs in their own partners. If even one life is saved because someone saw a red flag they might have ignored, Shanann's story reshapes its own ending. Every generation has a case that defines its fears. For the 21st century American suburb, this was it. The Watts murders dismantled the myth of the safe cul-de-sac, the idea that evil announces itself in obvious ways. It reminded the public that violence can be silent, polite. Well, understand that prevention begins not with suspicion of strangers, but with awareness of those we claim to know best. In journalism classrooms, the case is now taught alongside questions about ethics, privacy, and empathy. In criminology lectures, it's cited as evidence of how psychological fragility intersects with digital identity. And in living rooms across the world, it lingers as a warning whispered through the glow of our screens. Perfection is never proof of peace. As the years pass, the house on Saratoga Trail will eventually lose its notoriety. Grass will grow, laughter will return, and new families will fill the silence. But the story will remain a cautionary tale about perception, deception, and the fragile borders between the lives we share and the truths we hide. The legacy of the Watts family endures not through the crime itself, but through the conversations it forced America to have. In that sense, their story is no longer about death, but about what must change so that others may live. The legacy of the Watts family endures not through the crime itself, but through the conversations it forced America to have. In that sense, their story is no longer about death, but about what must change so that others may live. The legacy of the Watts family endures not through the crime itself, but through the conversations it forced America to have. In that sense, their story is no longer about death, but about what must change so that others may live.